has an announcement they want to make. So Ben Bobowski, who is Superintendent of the Wrangell-St.Elias National Park and Preserve, which is the largest wilderness area that the National Park Service is involved with. So I'm going to bring him up to the stage.
Good day, everyone. First, I just want to make a few acknowledgments and just thank the organizers, our hosts, and acknowledge that the work I do up at Wrangell-St.Elias National Park and Preserve is on the homelands of the Upper Tanana, the Eyak, the Tlingit, and the Ahtna peoples. And I'm grateful for my work and living with them every day on that landscape. The topic I have today is inhabited wilderness. And I'll be honest with you all, it makes me more than a little nervous to be with you today, because when you join the words inhabited and wilderness, it makes people feel uncomfortable. And yet it's probably the very topic that we need to spend a little time discussing. Before we begin too much into the presentation, I want to ask for a moment that you suspend all laws in your mind of what informs wilderness. Suspend them. Don't have judgment, okay? And I'll circle back to why that's important later on. But in order to break this cycle we find ourselves in from a field perspective, we must remain in a state of what's called superposition. That is, where the outcome of our decision or our position is yet unknown. Importantly, for many folks, wilderness is symbolic of all that humanity can be and all that it has failed to be. All that it can be and all that it has failed to be. To be certain, the ideas of wilderness offer inspiration. Wallace Stegner, in his famous wilderness essay, reflected on a geography of hope. And for those of you who know Wallace's essay and his perspective, it was with the Western United States. And in that perspective, I want to share with you some stories from the National Park Service, stories that the National Park Service protects from the Western United States that informs wilderness. First, from the perspective of looking west, I want to call upon the fact that we could see the fur traders and their pathways. And you'll see it's working a little slowly, but we'll get it going in the interest of time. That I can add in the number of park units that help tell that story. Next, I want to highlight and view the early expeditions, the trails, the railroads, and forts as the inspiration to the westward expansion and manifest destiny as it begins to take shape. I want to bear witness to many battles and massacres of indigenous peoples as westward expansion progressed. We can see the missionaries and the boarding schools that were established to assimilate the indigenous peoples and schools that segregated our Hispanic and our black citizens. We can imagine the livestock producers, the cowboys and sheep herders who built expansive empires and thousands of miles of fences fragmenting the landscapes. We can imagine the dust across the west. The Buffalo Soldiers are on the horizon, ready to assist with any number of park units. We can view the encampments that incarcerated our Japanese American neighbors during World War II. We can view the fragmentation of landscapes as fueled through homesteading, industrialization, and the installation of thousands of dams, forever changing the lifeblood that courses from the mountains, through the canyons, through the sea. And we can be overwhelmed by the creation of the world's largest incendiary devices designed to wipe out swaths of humanity. This human force was so staggering, so pervasive, it's forever changed our world. And as such, it should not come to surprise to us that to counteract the human forces of the time, fortress conservation, that model was also forged. And it was forged through force and with blood. Indeed, its force can be felt today. And this model has since been perpetuated and proliferated around the world for many of the reasons I described. And as many of you are aware, and some of you have lived with, the fortress conservation model results in human rights violations that are profound and continue today. So much so that the United Nations recently shared a report in which, and I'll quote, "Conflicts between communities and agencies implementing fortress conservation abound, as do reports of arbitrary detention, confiscation of property, forced labor, illegal searches, threats, intimidation, assault and battery, rape and other sexual violence, torture, and killings." It goes on to say that in this way, conservation measures that fail to adopt a rights-based approach violate human rights, including the rights of life, self-determination, development, health, food, water, and sanitation, a healthy environment, education, freedom from discrimination, and cultural rights. Wilderness, a form of fortress conservation, must be understood within this context. And until we reckon this history, as this Congress is trying to do, we'll not be able to break that cycle. And the fortress conservation model of the last century is not the model that will help us succeed in this century, and we must do better. I shared this version of history with you, importantly, because I have confidence and conviction in its truth. It's one that I've lived on the landscape, working in wilderness and protected areas, and I feel it at the gut level. With humility, I acknowledge that this is only one version of history among many others, and in fact, it's not the one that I was raised with. Since my early education, I've been fortunate to learn from many others about the many ways to be in the world, the many ways to live on this world, and I want to share with you a quote from anthropologist Wade Davis that helps explain it through language. Language is not just a body of vocabulary or set of grammatical rules. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which a soul of each particular culture comes into the material world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of spiritual possibilities. And these observations remind us that the world in which we live in does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of a particular set of adaptive choices that our lineage made many generations ago. After serving in a number of leadership positions in wilderness areas, I want to share with you some lessons learned that have helped me kind of grow as a person and as a community as we try to balance culture, nature, culture, wilderness. Inhabited wilderness. Wilderness that is living or occupied or home. This definition must be contingent based upon the local circumstances of the peoples that live there. Why inhabited wilderness? Well, an obvious reason for this construct going forward as we think about the concept of wilderness is that of the stories the National Park Service protects that I shared with you all today. This reason is sufficient enough. The human nature connections remain in the memories of cultures and individuals, and we need to be clear and sincere in our acknowledgement. In my experience, conversations around the topic of inhabited wilderness is a concept that generally resonates with traditionally associated peoples, both indigenous and European descended, in the protected areas I've worked with. Importantly, an additional reason why we need this construct is because, and I'll share, English critic and intellectual Leigh Hunt described that European and European descended people often have divided human comprehension between reason and emotion, enlightenment and romanticism, utilitarianism and aestheticism, ideas and reality, indeed peopled areas and non-peopled areas, civilization and what we call wilderness. Leigh Hunt was not the only one to bring this to our attention. Another English critic and intellectual, C.P. Snow, did the same thing with two cultures of science and humanities. So what can we do? Well, clearly we have a growing awareness of this need as evidenced in this Congress. And there's been much work, great work done, as we just saw on stage. I mean, that was a wonderful celebration with this new arrangement. But there's still a lot of work to do, as Reed pointed out. To build on that momentum, we need to take time to transform our culture of wilderness stewardship. And to do that, addressing the concept of inhabited wilderness on its own merits, Specifically, we need to break the cycle of divided human comprehension around the wilderness concept that supports implicit bias in management and decision-making. Creating a new construct of inhabited wilderness, not as exceptions to prohibitions, but on its own terms, will counterbalance much of that European-descended paradigm of wilderness. This alone won't fix the problem, but it begins to neutralize, from my experience, the immediate effects of the settler colonial constructs that are subconscious and in practice, thus opening doors to possibilities of working together and transformation. So how can we address this? And I'll be with you guys the next couple of days, and I look forward to one-on-one conversations, but I know we're also running a little bit behind, so I'm just going to skip across a couple of the highlights with this part. I want to highlight that my colleague and I have worked on a game called the Infinite Game. And the Infinite Game was developed by Kars. And the idea is just simply that it contrasts to finite games. Finite games have winners and losers, beginnings and endings, distinctions, conventions, final outcomes. In the Infinite Game, the goal is to keep the game in play. And within that Infinite Game, there's a recognition that there's more than one truth, more than one way to be human on this earth. And to play the Infinite Game as a superintendent, I just want to draw your attention quickly to these kind of contrasts, the mental models in which we think about it. On the left on your screen, you can see the finite game. It's one where we talk about balancing on a regular basis. That's really a transactional relationship that becomes exhausting over time because trying to reach that balance is exhausting. But if you change the mental model to the vision on the right, all of a sudden you can think about it in terms of reciprocal nature, win-win, and keeping the game in play. One of the models I've found helpful the last few years is from a paper Anderson in 2004 published about world peace. And he broke out peace just very simply from the individual peace one feels to global peace. He connects it to nature, and he also highlights the area in which I think as a superintendent it's important that I play a role, and that's in the area of cultural peace. That's local and civil. It's within context of my job on a daily basis. And it highlights that peace doesn't mean the absence of conflict. In its simplest terms, it's the ability to resolve conflicts with civility and to keep the game in play. Rules-based wilderness management is playing the finite game. This is why I asked each of you to suspend judgment and the laws and the policies of wilderness at the beginning. There are winners and losers. It doesn't mean that the rules aren't important, but when they're the first filter, you lose opportunity to find mutual purpose. If you take the time to understand it as the last filter, then you can realign what your mutual understanding is with your partners to the rules, which are often more capacious than we give them credit for, and then also we can find out where we may need to reform rules. A few of the tools that we use, we developed a couple toolkits, at least at a conceptual level. We're building them out now, Mark Fiji and I. The Human Tendencies Toolkit, I'll just offer really quickly, is focused on the elements seen there from instinct to capacity. If I said inhabited wilderness and your instinctive response was kind of, oh, that feels uncomfortable, that's all it is, just what you know instinct to be. Control is where we find wilderness oftentimes, controlling outcomes pretty deliberately. And then purpose is just referring to here, to trying to get the idea behind the finite, us, them, win, lose, to the infinite, a shared purpose. The competencies, I want to highlight the continuum because I think it's important, and it calls out the contrast between wilderness and inhabited wilderness. Okay, duality as a dichotomy indeed has a place in a protected area management, and in particular to what I ask of you today to consider. However, the purpose of the dichotomy is to grow understanding through the unity of opposites, the co-production of knowledge, alternative perspectives with potential for mutual understanding. It's not the us, them, it's the unity of opposites. Some of the lessons learned as I've gone through this endeavor for many years with wildernesses since the late 90s all the way to today is, first of all, is that this is the tough stuff of nature culture conversations that we must deal with, that all practitioners are implicated with but can't afford to be paralyzed by. And as Carolyn Finney points out, you carry with yourself your own limitations, biases, and unawarenesses. and that of the organizations into any new relationship. It's not that you need to be perfect, but you need to know exactly where you're at in your own growth in order to meet someone else with honesty and clarity and in order to do no harm. I'll share with you that as I've worked through workforce culture as it relates to lessons learned about working with our partners in wilderness, particularly our tribal partners, the first one is that there's more than one way to be. Saying we value Indigenous knowledge comes easily enough. Reconciling Indigenous knowledge and any other traditional way of knowing and being with Western science or federal laws and regulations, those of wilderness, is difficult, and there's much work to do. Our blind spot is that we often filter information through a lens of science or rules before really listening to the words and the knowledge being shared. And if you participated last night and in the presentations this morning, there's a lot of wisdom being shared. We most often accept diversity when it looks like us, and this limits our ability to find common purpose and mutual understanding. Reimagining wilderness, or reimagining any relationship, is scary for folks. Just being honest. Folks become comfortable in a way of thinking about something, and to transform that not only takes work, but it's just darn scary. But it's worth the investment. Letting go of control is difficult, and the hard part for some wasn't related to personal ego. Everyone I've met along the way really cares about the resource, whatever we call it. It's often has to do with our exceptionalism and how we identify carrying forward the ideas or the constructs of settler colonialism as they're trying to control and control and control. Letting go even a little has been painful for folks, but it has often made the difference. Some final reflections. To this day, many people regard the establishment of Yellowstone and the protected areas that followed in its image throughout the United States and the world, including wildernesses, as a beacon of hope. We can protect nature and the planet and are forever grateful to those conservation heroes of the American Conservation and Wilderness Movement. Heroes like Theodore Roosevelt, Marty and Olaus Murray, Aldo Leopold, Gifford Pinchot, John Muir, Henry David Thoreau, Wallace Stegner, and Barb Marshall, among many others. For others, fortress conservation wilderness is horror, despair, frustration, and results in the fracturing of culture and connection to society and nature. Wilderness has no hope because the people who live on it are disconnected. So I ask again, wilderness is a geography of hope to whom? And how do we see two sides to this history and find a way forward? I was once in the proposed wilderness, Glen Canyon National Recreation Area some time ago, and I took 5 different representatives of different cultural perspectives into the wilderness to look at a spring and a cattle allotment. Each of the 5 argued. They argued for nearly an hour, and each one was right in their conviction about what that spring was, how it related to wilderness, and what it should look like in the future. It started to remind me of the parable written by John Godfrey Sachs based on the famous legend of the blind men feeling the elephant, each one convinced what the elephant was along the way. And getting close to an hour into it, someone interjected through the discussions that we all loved the spring, each one of us there that day. Each one of us could see ourselves in that spring and that spring's future, but we couldn't see it together. But recognizing that we all cared for it, that we all loved it in our own ways, the concept of love became the concept we worked together with. And 5 people that wouldn't get along together all of a sudden found a way to work forward. Like many of you, I'm a warrior for wilderness, but also for cultural diversity. The two are forever entangled as one in the infinite game. What if biocultural diversity became the wilderness warrior's purpose? What if you took time this week to explore the concept of inhabited wilderness in this safe space among colleagues and friends? What if you took home an action item to transform wilderness and play the infinite game? Wilderness is currently symbolic to many of all that humanity can be and all that it has failed to be. Wilderness need not be such a dichotomy. It can also be home and hope for all of us if we want it to be. Thank you all very much.